Hi again, everyone. This is Roy Carter from Rectitude Media, and been kind of busy moving into the new place, as I said in my last video there. Anyways, a big thank you to Sammy and my RuneScape Clan 1 Elite SC for suggesting my home country as part of the next Economic Crisis series. Now, being that Canada is very dear to me, I feel it's necessary to go way back to just before World War I in 1913, with the Federal Reserve Act being implemented in the U.S., and the central banks began increasing the U.S. money supply. Amazed at the sudden explosion of growth and production, there was some talk about implementing a central bank in Canada by certain politicians, but it wasn't really until the Great Depression that the move towards a central banking system was deemed necessary. Now, when President at that time, Woodrow Wilson, sneakily passed the Federal Reserve Act around the Christmas holidays when most senators were at home with their families, J.P. Morgan and his cronies like the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, and the Rockefellers, among a few other titans of industry at that time, had set a financial time bomb. I'll go more into this during the U.S. installation of the Economic Collapse series, but the sudden increase in the money supply mixed with the harsh costs of the war effort and buying stocks, on margin with investors only having to put about 10% down on purchases, and they set up a couple of minor crashes amid wealth inflation until J.P. Morgan and his cronies silently exited the market and then called in their margin loans, creating a mass panic which led to the Great Depression. Now, yes, there were economists and politicians back then who knew that it was the central bankers who set this system up to fail, as the Federal Reserve practically halted the printing of money to a standstill, artificially causing widespread economic devastation that crippled the world economy. In Canada, though, we had the Canadian Bankers Association, which worked in conjunction with the Canadian government to ensure that Canadians didn't get completely screwed over. And with little to no Canadians having to rely on last resort lenders, Canada did pretty well in comparison, even though being in the war for much longer than the US was. These facts, though, didn't seem to matter once the Depression hit, as many were looking for someone to blame. In Canada, there was a shortening of the money supply and subsequent deflation due to our proximity to the U.S. as our closest trading partner. We had trouble paying for our foreign debts. This led to the implementation of the Royal Bank of Canada to rival the Bank of Montreal after the Prime Minister R.B. Bennett asked for a royal commission which ruled in favor of a central bank. Now, at first, this was chartered as a private entity, but then in 1938 was deemed a crown corporation, which meant that the central bank would elect a member from its own cabinet to be governor, and all ownership was given to the Canadian and British governments. Now, the money printing policies of the Bank of Canada actually helped finance Canada's involvement in World War II, and even the month-to-month finances of provincial governments using a structured principal plan. Now, a principal is a ratio of where the bank was required to have a certain amount of assets or currency in its vault for each dollar lent. Now, assets in precious metals, like gold and silver, were used as backing so that there never was an over or underprinting of money, which could lead to inflation or deflation. In fact, from 1935 upwards to the 80s, there was practically no increase in the federal national debt, even with a rise in global inflation. This is because the Bank of Canada would issue debt-free money to its borrowers, and there was no added costs aside from production of that bill, the few cents that it took to print that bill or the coins involved. However, to the central bankers, this also meant that Canada couldn't afford extreme expenditures without there being definitive consequences. Sorry about that in the background. We're just moving in, so there's some construction going on. However, to the central bankers, despite this fact, though, veterans, pensioners, social programs, education, healthcare, and government services prospered, with Canadians having control over the sale of most natural and man-made resources. Canada was strengthened from within, with money being invested in programs that helped people get back to work or improve living conditions and even infrastructure. The Trans-Canada Highway was a remarkable feat of ingenuity that was all funded by debt-free loans, which was quickly paid back in full. In 1957, Tommy Douglas set up a public health care system, which was remarkably stunning achievement which prolonged the average Canadian's lifespan, adding more value to the workforce and receiving international praise from countries around the world. The St. Lawrence Seaway was built, improving shipping and boosted imports and exports immensely, and also helped cement international trade routes around the world and amongst fellow Canadians. The Welland Canal was built, the railways were expanded, and Canada was able to keep a balance among its borrowing and spending, with investments going into without going into full fiscal irresponsibility. Canadians enjoyed one of the highest qualities of life in the world, which attracted the best and brightest minds from all around, which helped expand the economy. Now, looking at the state to where Canada's debt is now, during this video at $616 billion and counting, one can't help but ask the question, what the hell went so horribly wrong? Now, mind you, our debt isn't nearly as bad as the over $16 to $18 trillion of debt the U.S. is experiencing, as my country only has about 10% of its population as the U.S. You see, when it comes to the monetary policy, and recently its foreign policy, with Stephen Everything Must Go Harper, we follow a lot by the U.S. Central Bank's examples. Now, in the 1970s, there was a period of rampant inflation, with the U.S.'s creation of the petrodollar and its desire to rid itself from the gold standard. Now, when oil prices dropped and countries like France demanded its gold reserves and holdings back from the U.S., Richard Nixon abruptly put an end to what he called the rampant manipulation of speculators on the market. Instead of putting the blame rightfully where it needed to go with the Federal Reserve, the U.S. government had practically just told the rest of the world that they had no intention of paying back investors. Yet everyone was so punch drunk on the central bankers wanting to eliminate the gold standard, which kept money printing organizations honest, that they were fooled with the prospects of fast, easy money. So thus, the gold standard was abolished and the U.S. government began printing money like no tomorrow. In retrospect, a lot of prominent economists and dissidents like Noam Chomsky credited this purposely idiotic change of monetary policies on the Cold War East versus West mentality. By buying and selling in U.S. dollars, oil-produced allied nations were forced to keep a large supply of treasury bonds as a reserve currency, which is really the true heart of the American way of life, the U.S. petrodollar. Now, Canada at this time had seen that although gold and silver reserves kept bankers honest, they wanted to have the ability to grow as fast as the U.S. One of the main proponents of this push was the French-Canadian Paul Desmarais Sr., owner of the Power Corporation of Canada. You see, Paul was a huge player behind the scenes internationally, with many friends in the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission. Now, if there ever was proof of how much influence these corrupt, unelected officials have, the amendment of the Bank of Canada Act in 1974 is one of the most potent examples. In fact, Pierre Trudeau's election was kicked off in Power Corporation's headquarters, and he was thoroughly backed by Paul Desmarais throughout most of his, although most Canadians were unaware of the puppet master pulling the strings. With Power Corporation owning a majority of Canadian media outlets, Trudeau was portrayed as the great leader that Canada needed, and quickly became a favorite of the people. With his carefree, middle-finger-giving attitude, he was elected, and then set off to fulfill his appointed mission by Paul Desmarais. Pierre Trudeau did a few things to help Canadians, like, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it was his collusion with Minister of Finance John Turner and Governor of the Bank of Canada at that time, Gerald Bowie, that was the financial downfall of Canada. Now, I think it's important to show that Gerald Bowie was also a member of David Rockefeller's Trilateral Commission, and Rockefeller is also a chairman of the Bilderberg Group, even though he's ridiculously old and evil. Both the Trilateral Commission and Bilderberg Groups are very well known for promoting a global government, or what others have called a New World Order. This isn't a conspiracy theory, folks. Just don't take my word for it. Here's a direct quote from the eugenicist bastard himself.
Some even believe we, the Rockefeller family, are part of the secret cabal working against the best interest of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists. and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and am proud of it. Give in to the dark side.
Okay, that little part was ad-libbed, but most of everything else was from David Rockefeller. You can actually check out his memoirs, and it's on page 405. Sorry for talking like the Dark Sith Lord, but I just figured like it was probably the best way of actually staying true to his character. Now, Trudeau and his company of crooks used the recession as an excuse to amend the Bank of Canada, so that instead of the Bank of Canada issuing its own debt-free money, we had to rely on third-party private banks that would charge Canada a fee for each dollar printed at compounded interest. This allowed increased amounts of borrowing, but at a catastrophic cost. Many idiot politicians at that time described the period as Canada getting high on its own supply by borrowing way too much. However, this is completely incorrect. In fact, the money borrowed is less than 8% of the total money owed. That's simply because the compounded debt accumulated so fast that if the loan is not paid off really quick, it increases at unimaginable paces. This foots the bill with the Canadian taxpayer, who ends up overpaying for the original amount in most cases. A really great documentary on YouTube is Oh Canada, Our Bought and Sold Out Land. And I really recommend anybody who's listening to this to watch it. Although it was made in the mid-2000s, it speaks volumes at how badly Canadians have just been getting screwed. The sad truth is, this is what central banks do. They do what governments can and always have done, and extract wealth from nations by charging fees, promising that they won't misuse their power or crash entire economies. Yet we've seen time and time again that the central bankers and the roundtable groups that push for global governments are able to get away with these practices with impunity. Goldman Sachs didn't care about the Greek people when they fudged economic figures, profiting from their leveraged buyout scheme, destroying entire generations of European youths with crippling austerity and capital controls. You can practically see that from the amendment of the Bank of Canada Act onwards, national debt skyrocketed in Canada, robbing trillions of dollars of taxpayers' money overall, which siphoned off money from public programs and natural and human resources, like our healthcare system. Why hasn't the media touched this? Simple. Power Corporation and Quebecer Media, just like the New York Times and the 6 main media conglomerates in the U.S., have no vested interest in informing the public. Yes, the word gets out there, like the recent case brung forth by Comer and Rocco Galati against the Bank of Canada, but it's usually just mentioned as a side story, without informing Canadians on why our monetary system is completely corrupt. I'll give the CBC credit, though, as I've seen them do a 40-minute segment on what Comer is trying to achieve. But other news outlets affiliated with Quebecer Media are eerily silent on this issue. Now, this is just who prints the money in Canada, a fact that even our former finance minister Jim Flaherty was unaware of if you watch the documentary Oh Canada, Our Bought and Sold Out Land. I kid you not, it's funny, but in a way very sad at the same time. He didn't even know that the Bank of Canada was the one that printed money. He thought it was the Canadian Mint. See, Canada has a lot going for it. Our natural resources like land, fresh water, minerals, logging, and fisheries, just to name a few, are a staple of what makes Canada so beautiful. Yet unfortunately, these precious externalities are being sold off to the highest bidder so that Canada can pay off its compounded debt. It's a cycle of never-ending debt-based slavery that is commonplace practice for the central bankers. In fact, the entire world is now in $200 trillion in debt because of these corrupt policies that do nothing but siphon money from the ground up. What's created is a complete pyramid-shaped Ponzi scheme of immense proportions. When Canada first signed on to NAFTA, we gave up all our water rights to multinational corporations. When we gave up the tar sands in Canada so that unprocessed bitumen could be sucked up, shipped off, and exported to other countries to be processed, those jobs went with it. Both the Liberal and Conservative governments in Canada have silenced scientists who were exposing the heavy metal pollutants in communities living along the Athabasca River downstream for the corrosive chemical-laden tailings ponds, which have dramatically increased cancer rates among its inhabitants. They've cut funding to our healthcare system to such a point now where hospitals are understaffed, and people like my dad died from spreading cancers because they're on waiting lists for too long before they're able to get any freaking treatment whatsoever. Not to mention the rise of people that are dying from hospital-acquired infections because all the staff are cut back and hospital beds are reduced. Canada's healthcare system is a complete joke now because of just one stroke of the pen back in 1974 by Pierre Trudeau and his Paul Desmarais puppet master. Yet the majority of Canadians were and are still completely unaware of the Desmarais family and their funding of the future prime ministers. John Christian's daughter France even married Andre Desmarais, who co-owns the Power Corporation with his brother Paul Jr. After the passing of Paul Sr. just recently, hell, even Paul Martin was practically given $1 million steam line company by the Desmarais-run Power Corporation of Canada. Yet the mainstream media, for the most part, completely ignores the inner circles of one of the most influential families in Canada of all time. Yet the only real comprehensive reporting that was done was when Paul Desmarais Sr. died. I mean, even Nicolas Sarkozy came from France to pay his respects. Now, the monetary system that resulted from 1974 didn't just pull all future Canadians in debt until the dollar fails and we enter the age of RFID digital currencies. It helped bring drugs into Canada on a frightening pace. Another great video on YouTube just showing how the international bankers use drugs, exploitation, and control over debt and finances is The Crime of the Canadian Banking System by Bill Abraham. Now, I could go into the socio-economic policies, the change of party policies in Canada, and the sellout of every public asset for short-term gain strategies made famous by Harper's neoconservatives and so on. But you have to look at how the G20 and formerly G8, now I guess G7 summits were conducted under police state fascist authoritarianism. Journalists have had their careers completely ruined by goons like Stephen Harper, and I recommend anyone watching this to read Party of One, Stephen Harper and Canada's Radical Makeover, just to see how badly Canada has been corrupted in favor of multinational conglomerates over hardworking Canadian people. It's all there, folks. Enough corruption to make Rob Ford look like a damn altar boy at Sunday Mass. Now, we're marching headlong into a new Cold War 2.0 against Russia, supporting U.S. foreign policy like a clueless chihuahua who has neither the size nor the power to enforce its will. Canada has become nothing more than a lapdog of U.S. foreign policy, instead of the independent peace-seeking nation that we've been admired by the world for so long for. Canada backed the U.S. when they hired Al-Qaeda to take out Gaddafi in Libya, or supporting neo-Nazis in the Kiev government in Ukraine, and they've just broken the Second Minsk Agreement by shelling innocent civilians in the Lugansk and Donetsk regions. I've said it before many times in my videos that I refuse to take part in this East versus West mentality. I wouldn't want to live in America or Russia right now, as I just see both countries as corrupt extremes, each having their own severe pros and cons. I do, however, support the average people in those countries who are the ones who have to suffer in so many ways due to the childish behaviors that the leaders of the free world are displaying. This brings us to the upcoming election, and this is coming up in October. Now, for once, it's looking like Canadians are starting to get sick of Harper's Conservative Party corruption, as they can't even get their story straight on their economic statistics, which have been completely discredited by nonpartisan entities. In fact, under Harper's watch, he's had one of the worst economic records of growth and production in Canadian history, aside from Mulroney. For when it comes to production, I'm not 100% on that one, but it's pretty bad, I'm just going to say. Justin Trudeau, for the Liberals, on the other hand, is gaining popular support from younger demographics and activists who are pushing for legalization of marijuana. Yet he's completely for sovereignty-destroying free trade deals, flip-flopping on the unpopular Bill C-51 cybersecurity bill, and acts like a little child or avoids critical questions completely in person. As soon as anyone brings up the Bank of Canada, he whines that he refuses to speak about his father's legacy. And any talk related to the 1974 amendment to him is pure conspiracy theory. I mean, the balls on this kid. Denying historical fact, in my books, means he's not trustworthy at all, and either has no idea about Canada's morbid monetary policy, or just doesn't want people to know about it. That's really the only options. I mean, you know, you're in politics, you should know the fiscal and monetary policies and how it's screwing over Canadians. This brings me to Tom Mulcair for the New Democratic Party. Now I'm just going to go full disclosure here and admit that I'm kind of biased here, as I've been involved with my local NDP riding in Oxford for well over a year now. Yet I'm going to, spiel both the good and the bad objectively, as I advise anyone listening to my voice to do their own research and decide themselves. I'm not doing this video to tell you what to think, although it's obvious I have a severe dislike for Harper based on his past actions. What drew me into the NDP party initially was the really amazing people from my local riding. Brian Smith, the retired teacher and community activist, who is one of the key players in the fight against the dump near Ingersoll, really seems to give a damn about the community and protecting public health care. They really had their stuff together, considering they had a tiny fraction of what the 20-term riding of Conservatives had, but we came out in second place anyways. I told them of my concerns with the TPP, the New World Order, the corrupt banking system, etc., and they either agreed or had the same concerns as myself, which I thought was great. Same thing with Zoe Kunchner for this upcoming federal election. She even shares a few concerns with myself on issues that I had thought Tom Mulcair was concerned about, but with what I've been seeing from the televised debate and interviews, I'm starting to have my doubts. So I'm pretty much voting more for my local candidate, as I think Tom didn't go far enough. Although there's still more interviews and debates left to go, last year I went to the provincial councils in Toronto and the Southwestern Council in London. They talked about community postal banking that took the profits and invested back into the community infrastructure. They even had representatives from Comer, who I wholeheartedly agreed with, about how corrupt our monetary policy has become. I even addressed the issue of how free trade agreements are going to destroy Canadian jobs, and against Bill C-18, which puts us on the road for U.S.-style prohibition against farmers for saving their seeds for reuse or trade, a tradition that is often gone since the birth of agriculture itself. And it was well received. I even got appointed a really long title after my local riding suggested I accept the nomination for the Federal Equity Representative for Southwestern Elections Council for the NDP, which I won in a vote between me and a really nice gentleman named David. I felt a little bad afterwards, since I found out he had more connections to disabled people and other groups than I did, and is probably more suited for the job than I am, but now this all being said, there's some criticisms for the NDP party from an insider viewpoint. The main thing I noticed is that there wasn't really a concise message. The provincial election felt very generic to my writing, and head office made some pretty big mistakes by not giving out specific details about how the NDP plans for my local riding in Oxford. And all, it really felt like an amateur hour on their part, although I really don't have anything bad to say about the people in my local riding. They were super nice. The convention last November in Toronto was an interesting experience, to say the least. As soon as policy was being discussed, things got ugly. There were certain groups that obviously had their own agenda, and order had to be called quite a few times because of the clash of ideologies. In fact, we barely were able to get past the first 5 issues on each long list for different categories, which kind of seemed like the provincial meetings were overall a waste of time in the sense of creating policy. I got to read the policy book, though, which I really enjoyed, as it had information on the NDP platform that I couldn't even seem to find on their website. I figured that in some ways the different groups within the NDP were a good thing, as it wasn't just a bunch of rich old guys and, collectively trying to make money over people, but I have to say it didn't seem that professional. Now, with Tom, his federal minimum wage was a little misleading, as I thought he was talking about $15 per hour increase for all Canadians, which I later found out was wrong. I'm also not on board with the 100% with the carbon credits, especially if they're being bought, sold, and traded internationally, as it gives heavy polluters with more money the ability to just continue polluting by spending more money on leftover carbon credits. I am all for protecting the environment, but I am aware of the difference between real environmentalism and Agenda 21 fear-baiting. I'm for renewable energy sources as long as we can fully convert over, which we're not able to do yet, as most wind turbines are not able to store electricity over long periods of time. There are improving models of solar energy, such as the glass globe that focuses sunlight into a focal point that a French company recently designed, which I think is a really great idea. Tidal power is a neat alternative as well, but you don't really hear a lot about it. I'm very weary of tax-by-the-mile vehicles or rich elites who tell us all to use less while flying themselves and their entourage of servants around the world in private jets with their numerous multi-million-dollar mansions. I'm also not a fan of Mulcair's uncertainty on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There shouldn't be any debate on it. It's a bad trade deal. It's bypassing sovereignty. It's going to be worse than NAFTA. The NDP also failed the Canadian cash crop farmers by not opposing Bill C-18, which I see as more of a win for companies like Cargill and Monsanto than for farmers. Also, Tom Mulcair really disappointed me by parroting anti-Russian sentiment when he was asked about Ukraine. I mean, I really thought he'd be more about resolving peace instead of just jumping on the blame Putin bandwagon. He could have taken a high road. He could have, said that he was, going to instill traditional Canadian values by trying to make sure that nobody's, killing each other for no reason. Because it's sad. The Ukraine crisis doesn't need to happen. It was manufactured by George Soros when he decided to have his people fire on both the police and the protesters at the Maidan Square. Just sad. In my opinion, Elizabeth May did a better job voicing her disdain for the corrupt monetary policies, how the TPP could destroy Canadian sovereignty, and there's a lot that she said that really made sense. Although I do find that Elizabeth May of the Green Party goes way too close to Agenda 21 for my liking, as taxing individual things like going as far to tax junk food is completely against one's personal choices and freedoms. Their idea of true cost taxation seems like just too much government control for my liking. Although I do like their affordable housing plan, as it's only a matter of time before houses rise so high that not even the ordinary middle-class household incomes will be able to afford them, therefore causing an ultimate burst of the bubble. There's also Tim Moen from the Libertarian Party of Canada, and I'll admit, I like practically everything in their platform except their stance on healthcare and removing all tariffs. That's where they lose me. And the money they'd be getting back from having the Bank of Canada go back to printing its own debt-free currency would more than enough help fund a national public healthcare system. It makes no sense to me as why they'd want to repeal the Healthcare Act or remove tariffs that give CEOs more incentives to ship companies overseas to China. So I'm stuck with Mulcair as the lesser of the evils. But as for my true political party affiliation, there really isn't one that completely fits my idea for a better government at the moment. Now, before I finish, I'd like to get back to talking about Canada's housing bubble. I've already mentioned it in earlier videos about U.S. short sellers betting on the bubble to pop in Canada this fall or winter, and Canadians are going to be in one hell of a shock soon, to say the least. Now, with the mass amount of Chinese investment in Vancouver real estate, the slump in global oil prices, especially being felt in Alberta, and the skyrocketing condo scams in Toronto, there's a lot of factors at play here. Now you get mainstream analysts saying there's nothing to fear on BNN, but these are the very same people who didn't see the 2008 crash coming and did everything they could to help bullshit the dead cat bounce recovery in the United States. The proposed interest rate increases have been restated multiple times, and with a possible gold price shock coming after China sold the equivalent to what it declared it had in its vaults back in 2009 when it just recently lost the equivalent to 13 Greek economies, it's safe to say that the only sure thing is uncertainty in these upcoming months. Apartment vacancies are also up in Alberta and Vancouver, with there being a 3-to-1 ratio for average rent prices compared to the cheapest averages of rent in Quebec. Inflation is increasing, yet salaries aren't. Even the conservative-biased Fraser Institute admits that we're paying more just for living expenses than we ever did before. Financial advisor and author Hilliard Macbeth believes Canadian home prices sit on the precipice of their biggest crash ever as the multi-billion-dollar real estate industry gears up for the spring selling seasons. There are warning signs buyers and sellers should pay attention to. Puffed up by the years of ultra-low borrowing rates, home values have bloated to levels so far out of sync with the underlying incomes needed to support them that it's only a matter of time before one headwind or another blows over the house of cards. Hilliard Macbeth's new book, When the Bubble Bursts, is one of the most fulsome books yet at the current state of Canada's much fretted over real estate market. His call is that Canadian real estate is poised for a painful 40 to 50% drop in value when the bubble pops. When this happens, you can be sure that there are going to be a lot of rentier-class Canadians who buy up houses for renters that are going to take a huge hit. Whether or not it'll bring us into an economic collapse still remains to be seen, as we're all venturing into some murky depths without precedent. My best advice to anyone out there is to diversify, as stocks are rigged and the housing bubble is set to burst very, very soon, unless things heat up around the world geopolitically. With this, there are just so many countries that are in turmoil right now with the possibility of drawing NATO forces in conflict. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Well, I guess the only things left to cover is that Canadians apparently love Tim Hortons, hockey, and beer. I'll smack a Canadian flag as a thumbnail, and whammo! Instant Canadiana to help shine a bit of light on these grim potential circumstances. Well, keep on rocking in the free world, folks, and thanks for watching. Have a good one.